most always overshadowed on the global stage by China, India for sure is not to be ignored. Earlier this year, the Hinrich Foundation and the Visual Capitalists published an extremely compelling report on India's reckoning. Among the highlights, while India's climb to the world's third largest economy is one, quote, one of the defining achievements of global economic development and human willpower, it is still ambivalent about what this power means and how India views its strategic autonomy. Here to guide us on this examination of India's reckoning is a familiar face we met at the start, and that's Chuin Wei Yap, Hinrich's Director for International Trade Research. Joining Chuin Wei is Ronojoy Sen. Dr. Sen is Senior Research Fellow and Research Lead Politics, Society, and Governance at the Institute of South Asian Studies and the South Asian Studies Program in the National University of Singapore. He has worked for over a decade with leading Indian newspapers, most recently as an editor of the Times of India. His latest book is House of the People, Parliament, and the Making of Indian Democracy. He is also the author of A Nation at Play, A History of Sport in India and Articles of Faith, Religion, Secularism, and the Indian Supreme Court. So please welcome both of them here today.
Thank you, Kevin, and hi everyone again. Very pleased to join you again for this session on India, and I'm delighted today to have Dr. Sen with us. As Kevin mentioned, he's a senior fellow with the Institute of South Asian Studies here in Singapore, and the author of like 5 books now, and four, going on 5, by the way, right? And because he mentioned to me the last time we met that he was actually in the midst of writing his 5th, in the thick of it. And among the many accomplishments that you've had, you once worked at the International Olympic some authority at Lausanne.
I was conducting. Is this on? Yeah. I was conducting research there actually for my book on sport in India.
Right.
It was a short stint.
Right.
But yeah.
It was really interesting. In addition to the East-West Center, which is a highly regarded authority on Asia, and a host of other institutions, including in Washington, D.C. So the idea behind this panel, as Kevin mentioned, was kind of occasioned by almost an accident, because we were casting about at the foundation for an idea on which to commission a visual essay, which we do annually with an outfit called Visual Capitalists, which is our partners based in Vancouver. And we've done one on carbon. The first one we did was on carbon. The second was on water. The third was on data. And we were kind of thinking like, well, what do we do for the 4th? And thinking. And one day I was sort of like, just pottering about at home, and I was trying to commission someone to do a piece on India. And then it struck me, why don't we just do it visually? It coincided with a WTO ministerial that was coming up. And India's traditionally played an obstructionist role at the WTO, and that's quite well established and part of the record, and most of the ambassadors in Geneva will tell you the same thing. And this is something that Dr. Sen is going to add some dimension to, because as I was engaging with him in conversations, this sort of blends into the history of India, which he has deeply plumbed, as well as the ideas that underpin India as a nation. And I know many of you hail from that region, and I'm sure you'll have many questions, comments, pushback as we go. We welcome all, but if you could, give Dr. Sen maybe 20 minutes or so, that would be great. But I thought maybe a nice way to segue into this is to return to the subject of India as a nation. And this imagination, and a nation imagines itself. I mean, this dot that you're on right now, an island at the end of Peninsula, Southeast Asia, the idea of it being an independent state is insane. It's absurd. We are living on an absurdity, but we imagine ourselves otherwise. What about India?
India is an odd entity in the sense when it did become independent in 1947, along with Pakistan, when the partition of British India happened. I think one of the phrases that was used to describe India was India is an unnatural nation. And that was precisely because of the diversity in India. So India is really sort of a magnified version probably of the EU, both in terms of population, in terms of linguistic diversity. So the Indian Constitution, as the participants from India are well aware, has 22 official languages, and then you have many more dialects. So it's in some ways quite similar to Indonesia in this region in terms of diversity of language. And then, of course, you had the religious divide too, which was, in a sense, the basis of the partition and the so-called two-nation theory. So I think the general sort of prognostication, the predictions about India were fairly, damning and glooming at the time. But India, in a sense, has, over the last 75 odd years, shown that it has survived. Of course, it has proved to be resilient, and there have been sort of mechanisms, constitutional maneuvers, and in fact, the drafting of the constitution itself was quite remarkable. Given
when was that?
So the drafting happens between 1946, just before actually before independence, and it's completed at the end of 1949, and India is officially, announced as a republic on 26th January 1950, which is also celebrated as the Republic Day. So the drafting of the constitution is, done by people elected on the basis of elections that were conducted when the British were still around. In 1945, 46 is when the elections happened. And it's quite remarkable that this document, which is in fact the longest, India has the longest, as again some people in the room are aware, the longest constitution in the world, but also it's the most amended constitution. So, well over 100 amendments and counting, So it's a remarkable document that's quite progressive in its intent. It's stood the test of time. Of course, we can discuss, during the Q&A where, some of the frailties of the constitution and how, maybe it hasn't, been able. But by and large, I think it's stood the test of time despite the many amendments. So I think India, started off on a fairly, to use a cricketing analogy, on a sort of weak wicket, but it did, I think, has had remarkable success in many ways, and of course there are, many issues too, which we can, come back to. Yeah.
No, absolutely. It is now the third largest economy in the world by PPP, and the idea of that happening in about 80 years now. Well,
yeah, roughly.
Thereabouts. It's perhaps there is some inevitability in it, given the size of India, but also not necessarily so. Certainly not at the outset. And I think one of the things that you talked about, I want to circle back to, which is the issue of language, and the issue of language. The theme that sort of of this panel is really about India's ambivalence about using its newfound power, its place in the world as a nation to shape, in our context, international trade, but really the broader global multilateral framework. Dr. Sen touched on language, but you also talked about something else, which is the frailty of India's inception, and you talked about something about Churchill and his stacking of the odds of India's survival. Is there a way you could sort of touch on both?
Right. Yeah, I didn't mention. I think I discussed Churchill, in a private conversation earlier. And Churchill, and I think in general, a lot of the British establishment, especially the conservatives, were deeply pessimistic about the future of India, and part of it had to do with, as I said,
as an independent state.
As an independent state. So they I think most of the analysis in the late 40s, early 50s, coming from the West, did not see India really surviving, beyond maybe a decade and a half. They foresaw a breakup of the nation, and language was one issue, and of course religion was the other. So the partition had already happened, of course, as again some of you are aware in the room, that India, of course, has a very large Muslim population. So if you look at the Muslim population in India would actually be the third largest Muslim population in the world after Indonesia and Pakistan. So these were, I think, two sort of, major divides within India. But the linguistic, so India always, the constitution, even though it did not have the word secular in the constitution official, that was only introduced in 1977 when Indira Gandhi was the prime minister, but it always portrayed itself as a sort of pluralist, multicultural nation. This was also done often in opposition to Pakistan, which was founded on as a religious state, as a homeland for the Muslims of South Asia. So that was one element. On language, I think the linguistic reorganization of the Indian polity, which happened in the 50s, was quite critical. In fact, what is somewhat forgotten these days is Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first prime minister. Of course, now he's often seen as the sort of villain of the piece in contemporary times. Everything he did was apparently wrong. But I think he too was actually quite reluctant about the linguistic reorganization. His hand was actually somewhat forced by movements that happened, particularly in southern India. And this is quite relevant because in Singapore we of course have a very strong population from the south, especially from Tamil Nadu. And there were these agitations. In fact, there was this very famous at the time agitation that happens in Andhra Pradesh, about the recognition of Telugu, which is the official language. So this sort of forced the hand of Nehru and the government, and linguistic reorganization took place where states were the provinces within India were organized around the principle of language.
Right. So for the purposes of the non-Indians in the room, could you just describe what you're talking about? The north, the south, which languages predominate?
Right. So India does have an official language, which is Hindi, and then English, of course, the linked language. So India, interestingly, does not have a national language. That's sometimes forgotten. And all the other languages are, 22 odd languages have an official status within the.
Did you say 22?
Yeah, 22. That's officially recognized in the constitution. So, for instance, you would have Tamil, which is one of the official languages in spoken in Tamil Nadu in southern India. And that's those of you who've gone around in Singapore would have heard announcements being made in Tamil along with Mandarin, Malay, and of course English. So you have a set of language in South India, which is Tamil, Telugu, Kannada, Malayalam, etc. And then in the north you have again a bunch of languages, and then from where I come from, West Bengal, Calcutta, Bengali is spoken, and all these languages have a extremely rich heritage, rich cultures. Bengalis are extremely proud of their, language and culture, as are, Tamilians, as are, So I think that's something that was recognized both by, in the constitution as well as the linguistic reorganization that happened. So, that took care of some of these sort of pressures that were bubbling beneath the surface in terms of, which might have posed a threat to the nation. And just a quick analogy, in South Asia, you have the case of Sri Lanka, or it was Ceylon earlier, where, in fact, if you compare, the policies that were followed in Sri Lanka, and I don't know whether we have anyone from Sri Lanka in this room, right? And, she'd be well aware of, how the, Sinhala versus Tamil, that debate took on a completely different turn. So from the 50s itself, so Sri Lanka becomes independent a year after India, so 1948. The Sri Lankan sort of state and the government very quickly follows a Sinhala-only policy, which discriminates against Tamils. And then, as we know, the unfortunate story where Tamils feel victimized, and then that kind of leads from the 80s onwards to the formation of a militant movement, the LTT, and so Sri Lanka took another turn, which I think language became a huge issue along with other sets of cultural issues. Whereas I think India managed, in a way, to keep the sort of linguistic tensions in check. Although we did, as I said, there were serious agitations, and especially in South India. But I think the linguistic reorganization did take care of that, and India, I think, managed to sort of cross that hurdle thanks to the policies followed by the government of the time.
Right. Do you think that the answer that was taken by Singapore post-colonialism was to adopt English as the administrative language and what they call the first language, and the idea being that your second language, everybody had to take a second language. It is what they call your mother tongue, and in my case, because I'm ethnically Chinese, it's Chinese. But for a lot of Indians here, so Tamil was designated as the second language for Indians, which actually a lot of Indians here objected to, because they say that, well, that's not my language. But it is what it is. In India's case, the repudiation of empire, and probably because the Indian experience with empire was very different, starkly different than Singapore's, than anyone's, than any other colonies, I think, in the British Empire. The repudiation of English was, I suppose, one of them in a way. Do you think it should have been done differently? And how much of that repudiation seeps into what India imagines of the world today and its place in it?
And English is, of course, when India becomes independent, all or a majority of the nationalist leaders, primarily then, from the Congress party, are English educated, really English educated elites, right? So, in fact, not only are they English educated,
the way Macaulay wanted it.
The brown Englishman in a way. So, Gandhi occupies a somewhat different place, although he himself was also a barrister, right? So the tradition then was, most of them, were lawyers trained in England and then came back. So Nehru, Gandhi, Patel, who's not so well known outside of India, was also a barrister. So English was, of course, naturally enough the language of where of operation, in a sense, and that has actually continued. English does still operate as a linked language. Business is still conducted in English, but again, those who are from India will be aware there has been increasingly, I would say, over the last decade and a half, a thrust to make Hindi more prominent in the sort of language of administration of government. And this, of course, is a sensitive issue because, as we just discussed minutes back, that language is something that's quite integral to the identity of many of the non-Hindi-speaking states from the south, the state where I come from, Bengal, states in the West. So it's the thrust to sort of, or the emphasis on Hindi does, I think, pose a certain set of issues. We are at a point where we don't really know. I think we hear a lot of noises, we hear a lot of announcements, sometimes informally, that more and more business will be conducted in Hindi, and of course, those who are from India will have a better sense of where this is headed. But I think as of now, India is still not completely taking the plunge on sort of making Hindi the sort of the official sort of language of business in India. I think that will be a difficult call to take given the linguistic diversity in India. But just to sort of maybe take a segue, there's also, we've been hearing a lot about India's sort of older name, the Sanskrit name is Bharat, right? So I did hear a couple of years ago that there were moves afoot to sort of change India's name from India officially to Bharat. So in the constitution, both are mentioned. India, that is Bharat, is a constitution of such and such, etc. I think the government has, sort of, maybe my journalist friends will be able to, give me the exact status of where it stands, has kind of pulled back from that as of now. But there are, many within the ruling establishment that would actually like the name sort of to be officially changed.
Yeah.
So these are the kind of tensions that we see in, again, coming back to the idea of India.
Idea of India, yeah.
Where does India stand? And very quickly on the sort of repudiation of British rule, colonial rule. Of course, we know all the ills that come with the sort of exploitative, the colonial state. And India, of course, was, the cliched jewel in the crown. But, it was, it was sort of the maximum amount of resources were being extracted from India. Although, that's a debate that we don't, we can go into later, where the British, the colonization, that the British did was sort of fundamentally different from that followed by, so the Dutch in Southeast Asia or the Portuguese elsewhere in Africa, whether it was more enlightened in a way or whether it had sort of more liberal tendencies.
The Dutch in Indonesia was not pretty.
No, that's what I'm saying. So the British have been sort of favorably, compared in a way. And, it's surprising to the extent to which, I've been, so my current work is on intellectual history of Hindu nationalism. That's been where, and I've been looking at a lot of figures like, Vivekananda, Tagore, and it's surprising the extent to which many of them actually found the influence of the West and the British actually, they were critical, of course, but they also found certain, good things in. But that's something, we can go into it if there are questions. But just very quickly, on the repudiation of the British, is very much, if you sort of compare, since we're talking a little bit about Singapore, we just look at sort of street names, places of cities. India has completely, has followed the path of obliterating, sort of the British presence, right? So, cities, localities have been renamed. So the, Calcutta, where I come from, the sort of the main square in the city. Calcutta, of course, also has been renamed. It's called Kolkata, but I still like to. I think it's perfectly fine to refer to Calcutta as Calcutta when you're speaking and referring to it in English, and Kolkata is what you refer to it as in Bengali. So, but anyway, Kolkata, Calcutta has been renamed, but there's been a lot of other cities, Bombay to Mumbai, Madras to Chennai. But if you look at street names, so for instance, in Kolkata, you have Dalhousie Square, which is kind of the center of the city, which has been renamed after three nationalists, and it's called Binoy Badul Dinesh Bagh. But it's still Dalhousie Square is a name that still sticks. Whereas in Singapore, you will find locations and places which all have colonial names, right? So some of you who've been around might have seen Outram Park, right, which is a major sort of metro station. But when I teach my courses in South Asia at the university, if I ask the students, are they aware of who Outram was? Most of them don't know. Outram was in fact sort of figure who was quite prominent in quelling the so-called 1857 mutiny, which was the first major uprising against the British. So in
Popularly but inaccurately called the Sepoy Mutiny.
yeah, it's called the Sepoy Mutiny. I think it's more politically correct nowadays to call it the 1857 uprising, but it was much more than a Sepoy Mutiny. So I think Singapore, and of course, Raffles, the founder of Singapore, is given. You still have a statue, and you have the Raffles Square, etc. Where in India, you won't have anything comparable. So again, coming back to Kolkata, the founder of Kolkata was a man called Job Charnock. So there's nothing, no location in the city where you'll find sort of Charnock's name associated with. It's been, completely down. So India's followed that path,
It's pretty remarkable. It's true about Singapore. It's we've kept many of the Britishisms, I suppose, including terms like permanent secretary,
Right.
which I always find it odd because the term refers to neither a secretary nor permanent.
Right.
And over there, in fact, we've kept it so much to the extent that over there that's called Empress Place.
Right.
And it's not named for the Empress of Singapore. There never was an Empress of Singapore. It's named for the Empress of India,
And in anywheres where
who
I
was not
teach,
Indian.
you have Prince George's Park and
Right.
things
Yeah.
named after
And to Dr. Sen, you're very diplomatic about Outram, but he was brutal.
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
And we have an MRT station that's named after him, and nobody knows. But that's the extent of the differences in that inheritance and that willingness to accept that inheritance. But and it plays into trade because of the way nations then conduct international trade on the basis of what they view as fair, and within the rights of where they came from. I think caste is something that plays something into that psyche, something that the British never eradicated. The Indians never truly eradicated. Is that fair?
Caste again is a very is a complex beast. Right? Of course, it's stylized, and I think you have it in your in the slides, in the nice visual commentary that you have of India.
What I wanted, nobody ever sees this, but the blue blocks. I wanted something of the peacock somewhere in this visual essay, because the peacock is
it is the national. Yeah.
India's national bird.
Yeah.
And I said, could you put something of the peacock in there, but not in an obvious way? And nobody knows. Not a single person has ever identified this. But in the blue is the eye of the peacock's feather. Anyway, that's our little Easter egg.
Right. Yeah.
Sorry, there it was. All right.
Yeah. So in a way, this is kind of a stylized representation of the again, if you have to talk about the caste system, you probably need more than a couple of hours. But it's sort of, you have the Brahmins sitting at the top, and then you have 4 castes, and then you have a set of people, just the former untouchables, those who are in government terminology, scheduled castes outside the pale of the caste system. But the caste system, some argue was actually sort of solidified during, in a sense, during the time of the British. They actually contributed to, in a sense, the solidification or the permanence of the caste system, although it's a system that goes back several centuries. Of course, in post-independent India, the constitution took the route where, of course, untouchability was treated as a crime. Of course, it's another matter. We can discuss whether it's been, actually eradicated. Whether these sentiments, of course, remain. But India also took the route of providing for reservations or quotas for the scheduled castes, as well as the indigenous people of India who are, known as Adivasis, or again in government terminology, the scheduled tribes. So there's roughly 22 odd percent, 22.5% reservation or quotas for the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes combined. And then there is another set of quotas for, it's extremely complicated. So you have another set of groups called the other backward classes who are lower castes, but not that's not represented here. And I think the numbers here are a little. I think it's from a Pew survey. We can actually. I think the numbers might be a little off, but as we speak, there's also a caste census being done in India, where some states have done it, but we don't really have the results of the national caste census. It's also a bit of a shame that the Indian census, for whatever reason, actually it's happened decennially from 1891 onwards. So this is the first time in well over a century that India actually hasn't been able to publish its census, which should have been out in 2021, but got delayed due to the COVID. But we still haven't seen the census results. Again, we might have some insights from my friends in the room as to why, although I think now it's going to be announced officially 2027. So we don't really have the exact latest numbers for the different castes, but I think India has taken the route of providing for reservations, for quotas. Again, we can discuss the legacy of that, but caste, I think, does remain it's still a thorny issue. With increasing urbanization, we've seen some of these sentiments maybe perhaps becoming weaker. But again, in rural India, depending on different parts of the country, that these sentiments still remain very strong.
Yeah.
And that
Do you see that translating into well, not caste in itself, but in the totality of everything that you've portrayed, playing to how India conducts itself in the international trade forum?
No, I don't really see a direct connection between sort of the caste and its various implications. Right. Of course, you did have the slide on the earlier slide where agriculture contributes to what 45 odd percent of the economy. But what's missing there is that, and if you look at India's GDP, even though agriculture is roughly almost 50%, people occupied in agriculture, it contributes, I think, roughly to 16 or 17% of India's GDP. So there's a serious mismatch there. But the fact is that since there's so many people employed in agriculture and so many people make a living out of agriculture, India's position in the WTO, in trade forums, is of course dictated by. You did mention that India has always been a bit of an obstructionist. And I remember back in the day when I was a journalist, I think there was this phrase that was affixed to India, Dr. No, right? Which is the title of a James Bond film. And India was always saying no to. I think that's changed. Again, I'm not an expert on trade, but I do believe India has become more flexible. But I think a lot of positions that India takes in global trade forums is, of course, dictated by the number of people who are in agriculture, and also the politics around so if you're a lot of your voters, of course, are from employed in agriculture, are from rural India, of course your stance both domestically but also externally will be dictated by your by the electorate, by your voters. So that's right. I guess case I guess everywhere.
Yeah. It brings to mind something that Lee Kuan Yew, also a lawyer, by the way,
right,
once said.
Same kind of legacy, right?
Same kind of legacy. But he said that the difference between China and India is that in India, you have chief ministers, and the chief minister is elected by the people.
Right.
And you have the prime minister telling him, well, you got to do this, and he'll say, oh, yeah, okay. Mm. And he won't, because the prime minister does not appoint the chief minister. Whereas in China, if you happen to be a party secretary in a province and you don't do as you're told by Beijing, so that's That's a great way to. We're happy to take questions. One of the reasons why we wanted to have this visual essay put out also is to share with you as journalists that there are visual ways to tell a story. That it doesn't have to be just textual, and you can weave in a lot of different techniques. We do this with our visual capitalists all the time. In telling that story in terms of data, and in terms of even using the motifs of the theme of whatever you're writing about to tell that story. I'm happy to talk more about it if you want during Q&A, but just something that I wanted to touch on. Something else I just wanted to mention is that in the composition of this visual essay, we did put it to a team of Indians. And one of the feedback that came back was we were using too many North Indian images. So we cut those back and put in a lot more of what we thought was representative, which I think was is kind of a nice allusion to what you were talking about, Dr. Sen, right at the start. But does anyone have any questions? Okay, you first, and then Amanda. Ladies.
Hi, I'm Amanda from the Wall Street Journal. I'm based in Singapore. So as we know, I think India is navigating a very challenging macro economic era. With the stock market undergoing a correction this year, and World Bank actually projecting that India growth will moderate this year, and with low inflation and high growth. In your opinion, do you think that India economy has actually picked its Goldilocks moment, or are we already in the Goldilocks moment for India?
Maybe two at a time. I don't know how much time we have. Yeah.
Why don't we take two questions and then Dr. Sen will.
My question is related to democracy and all that. Why India managed to survive its democracy at the same time when other countries got independence, slide into autocracy or military rule? India seems to be exception among all the nation who got independence during late 40s or 50s. What do you see the reason behind this, and how it connect to the market also? That how it helps?
Yeah. So I must preface my answer to Amanda saying that I'm not really an expert either on the economy or trade, but from a kind of a informed observer point of view. I think India was, there was a consensus that there was this so-called Goldilocks moment. But I think that might have been lost due to the current scenario. Of course, all of you are aware of what's happening in Iran, and then before that you had the Ukraine crisis, it's still ongoing. So I think India is now facing a sort of a rough time, as are a lot of nations in the world. And I think there was a graphic here which showed in your slides the extent to which India is dependent on external sources for its energy, right? And some of that, of course, has got disrupted, by the. And I think there's also maybe a graphic on the shipping routes too, right? So the Hormuz, is quite critical, for Indian supplies. So I think that moment, and India is like a lot of other nations facing headwinds. So, the growth rate India might, I'm not sure whether they'll be able to maintain, but I think that Goldilocks moment might have, to my mind, passed. And your, much larger and complicated question on, how India sort of managed to survive. It's difficult to sort of put your finger on one particular factor. But I think the constitution that I mentioned, the fact that India managed to craft a constitution, it took 3 years, so it wasn't, it wasn't done very quickly. The fact that it managed to, craft a constitution that stood the test of time, but also led to the holding of elections within, 4 years, roughly, of India's independence. And importantly, it was also India went for universal franchise, which was, in a sense, as one of the members of the Constituent Assembly quite eloquently put it, it was like a leap of faith. Because India, when it became independent, was largely illiterate, extremely poor. For a nation of that kind to actually go for one person, one vote was quite something. And I think the first election, and there is apparently, I did see the other day, there's a film being made on that first election, which I think will be telecast fairly soon on one of the streaming channels. I think Netflix. I think the first elections, which was held very successfully, and the successive elections which have happened regularly on time. There have been some questions occasionally raised about fairness, etc. But I think we've kind of crossed that hump too. So I think regular elections, one person, one vote, and a general adherence to the constitution. So if you just look at the rest of South Asia, none of the other South Asian nations have actually had one constitution kind of, they've had multiple constitutions. Constitutions have been scrapped. You look at Pakistan, you look at Bangladesh, look at Sri Lanka. So India, again, a much amended constitution, but a constitution that I think has, stood the test of time. So I think those are roughly the factors, where India, I think, managed to, led to India's survival, and it kind of managed to kind of, tackle the other issues which were of enormous, proportions when India did become independent.
Yeah, one of the things that Dr. Sen and I talked about was about how close India possibly came to going Marxist. Because if you guys recall, 1917, Russia goes communist, and then 1949, China goes communist. These are the large, pivotal landmasses, geographies, powers that shape the world today. And in 20th century, that defines, the great contest. So anyway, we can segue back to that. So you had a question, had a question.
Go ahead, Raja.
Elliot had a question. So how should why don't you go first and then?
Hi, Dr. Sen. My name is Raja. I'm from the MOOC Nayak. So my question is that how India can make good relation with China, and is good relationship with China, India become a superpower according to you in coming 20 or 25 years? And how India can just name, when Nehru became Prime Minister of India, he started the NAM, Non-Alignment Movement foreign policy. So is India lead that multipolar world in coming days? What's your opinion? I don't know, so that's why I'm asking you.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Cecilia from NHK Japan Jakarta Bureau. Related to Raja's question, actually, I want to know how India fits or engage with ASEAN. We know that India and ASEAN already have many frameworks like ASEAN-India Free Trade Agreement and ASEAN-India Plan of Action. But do you think that the presence of India in ASEAN helps to reduce the pressure to choose US and China within the ASEAN countries? My second question is Indonesian President Prabowo Subianto will have a meeting with Modi next month in July. So what can be expected from the meeting between these two global South leaders? Thank you.
Right. So should I just take those two? Yeah. Of course, there are not two. There are more than two questions. But the first two, maybe take Cecilia's question. Again, these are areas. Again, I'm not entirely an expert on, but I think on the, I'm not really sure what will come off the meeting between, the Indonesian and the Indian Prime Minister. But just to sort of, note that India and Indonesia are actually, economies or polities or nations that ideally should have actually had, far more by way of relations. It's actually something that's quite surprising that India and Indonesia relations have been so sort of minimal. One might say that comes back to actually the non-aligned movement where Indonesia was also a part of. So that's just something I really don't know what will come up, but I imagine that there will be talk of greater cooperation, greater trade link, which is something that hasn't happened. And I think even in terms of sort of polities, of course, India is a Hindu majority country, Indonesia is a Muslim majority. But there are quite a few similarities in the sort of the political structures in given the the diversities of the two countries. So I think there are interesting parallels and more work needs to be done on sort of India Indonesia compared. India ASEAN, I think I think the links are growing. Singapore is of course one of the big trading partners of India and one of the really big investors. Something that's not sort of known outside the region. There are significant Singapore investment. The rest of ASEAN, I think it's still lagging. This was something that I think started from the 90s. India's closer links with the Southeast Asia was initially an idea of sort of looking east, which was something that came up during the early 90s, and then we've kind of reached the stage where I think the slogan is Act East. So I think that's something that's a story that's developing that's only going to expand. And I think you did have a slide where you had a section on the free trade agreements that India has increasingly been signing more and more free trade agreements, and the latest was with EU, and this is partly as a response to sort of India's relationship with the US, the trade tariffs that were imposed. So I think India is diversifying its sort of links, and I think that kind of segues into the question on China that Raja. You had, again, I don't know the answer to how to improve India-China relations, but again, I think there is a graphic here which shows, although India and China, of course, they fought a war way back in 1962, memories of which, the scars of which still remain somewhat fresh in India, and something that, of course, India was. It was a heavy defeat in some ways. Wars don't always, end in, kind of a victory or defeat. But in that case, India was, suffered a blow, and that hasn't been forgotten. And of course, in the long border that India and China shares, as you're aware, we've had regular border skirmishes. In fact, we've had more in the last decade or so, right? There's been a kind of uptick in the last decade, even though people who deal in foreign policy would say this is fairly well managed. It's kind of not gone, out of proportion. So I think on that count, in India-China relations have been relatively stable, and we've seen, Prime Minister Modi, reaching out personally to Xi Jinping. They've had these one-on-one summits, etc. But despite all that, of course, we've also had the border issues. But I think the mitigating factor there is the trade, right? It's been India-China trade has sort of ballooned. If you look at the numbers from roughly 2000 onwards, it's just sort of gone up by a multiple of probably 10 maybe. But of course, that's also offset by the huge trade deficit. I think that's not there in the slide, and that's something that is very worrying for India. So I think there is a pie chart, right, where in some very critical segments, right, including pharma, where a lot of the sort of raw materials, the components are coming from China. And India has been trying to sort of diversify on its supply chains. And again, I'm not an expert on this, but, again, from an informed observer point of view. But I think India has not been, that successful in diversifying its supply chain. So I think the dependence on China for much of its sort of resources, raw materials, is not going to go away. So that kind of behooves India to have a close relationship with China. That's something that's not going to go away. But in terms of the finally the great power status, I think China is somewhere that India aspires to reach. But India, I think, even though India is sort of third in that, as you mentioned, in terms of GDP. But if you look at sort of in terms of PPP, India kind of slips a little bit. So the size of the economy is big, but it's still a long way to go to sort of the state of China. Just as an aside, since we are in the midst of the World Cup, at least there's one place where India and China have something in common. Both have not been able to make it to the World Cup, and that's something quite astonishing. That's something that always makes makes me think and worry. Why these two countries with enormous population base repeatedly fail to make the World Cup, but that's maybe an issue for another day.
Yeah. I mean, you're a sports.
That also comes from the fact that I'm a sports historian.
But the per capita disparity is striking.
Also striking,
5,000-ish in India versus 12,000-ish in China.
Absolutely.
Versus about 80,000-ish in the United States.
And also, if you look at the Human Development Index, I think India is really, way down in the list in the UN HDI. Yeah.
So we have Elliot,
Hi, this is Asaduzzaman from Bangladesh, and I work for the Daily Star. And my question is, as you all of know that India and Bangladesh has a close relationship for the bad times, but currently, how India sees its geopolitical issues? Because there are
common issues. Sorry, I missed that. Currently,
how currently India sees its geopolitical relationship with Bangladesh? Because there is a popular conception, many Bangladeshis, not all, that India always try to impose its own culture on Bangladeshi people, especially after uprising 2024 in August, when the ousted Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina moved to India. And is there any, what do you mean that, is there any possibility to Bangladesh to turn on China when India tries to its authoritarian rule? Thank you.
I promise. Fulfilling some promises here.
Hello, sir. This is Mohib Khan from Pakistan, Balochistan. Sir, how can India and Afghanistan strengthen their economy and economical and political relation in coming years? Because the Wagah border is closed for Afghanistan trade. Chaman border is closed between Afghanistan and Pakistan, and the Iran border with Balochistan, that is also closed. So there is any other gateway for Afghanistan?
Right, yes. Some of these questions are a bit out of my league, but I'll try and address them because I'm not really a sort of foreign policy expert. On the question of Bangladesh, of course, being a Bengali, I do follow events and I read the Daily Star actually on occasion. So thanks for the question. So yes, I think India finds itself in a tough spot vis-a-vis its relationship with Bangladesh, because Bangladesh was in a way one of the few bright spots in India's relationship with its neighbors, right? So of course, the old saying is you can't choose your neighbors, and India has always sort of found itself in a hostile neighborhood, and of course, given India's size, it's also seen as a sort of big brother in the neighborhood. And India's, of course, good relations with Bangladesh it was in 2012, right, when Sheikh Hasina was elected, right, was predicated in many senses with a very close relationship with the Sheikh Hasina regime and the Awami League. So, in a sense, when she fled the country, I think that dealt, quite a blow to India-Bangladesh relations, and that's been compounded by the fact that Sheikh Hasina has found refuge in New Delhi. And I think India-Bangladesh relations have not really recovered from that. I think there are efforts being made. I think now that you have a newly elected government, the BNP, etc. I think there is some efforts to mend the fences, but I think there is some ways to go before, India-Bangladesh relations reach, a sort of even keel. And your question, your related question on China. China already, of course, has a significant presence, right? So we were talking about India-China relations, China's presence in all the other South Asian nations, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. We know, Sri Lanka is actually a case study of how, China's, and debt diplomacy, works. Again, we don't need to go into that. So Bangladesh, of course, has its options, and, China remains, a viable option, for Bangladesh too. And I think Bangladesh already has done a little bit of that, is going to do more of that in terms of diversifying its bet. So I see, China's presence in South Asia actually, it's already there. It's only going to increase. Nepal too is another country which really, even though it really depends on India for a lot of things because it's landlocked, has its relationship with China has only grown. So that's going to, happen further. Your question on Afghanistan, I'm probably going to cop out. I don't really have a good answer as to how, but you're right. There are a lot of, sort of obstacles and blockages in terms of, and that's primarily got to do with India's relationship with, Pakistan, which, unfortunately, there was some, there was a sense that, when the BJP came to power, often when you have, when the only other instance of the BJP being in power was, when Prime Minister Vajpayee was the Prime Minister between, 1998 to 2004, there were actually significant, measures undertaken to improve the relationship between India and Pakistan, right? Counterintuitively, you would think that maybe when you have a Hindu nationalist party in power, relations are going to go south, but that wasn't the case. So you had the famous bus ride to Lahore, etc. And Prime Minister Vajpayee was actually invested in the relationship. We were talking about sport. It might seem trivial, but actually there was a very sort of famous India-Pakistan cricket tour that happened, and India traveled to Pakistan after several years to play cricket. So there were all these moves that happened, but this has not happened in the last the 12 or 14 years that the current government has in power. So I don't really see much happening by way of the trade routes opening, the Wagah border. I think these are unfortunately kind of, I think trade is held hostage to the the larger question of the India-Pakistan relationship. So yeah, I don't really have an answer. I think India-Afghanistan ties are of course on an uptick, but what kind of trajectory that will take, I can't really foresee, because I think there was a sense that when the Taliban came to power, people were kind of unsure about where the relationship would go. But India is actually again counterintuitively, I think the relationship with the Taliban is or with the Afghanistan government is on a fairly strong footing, as are relations with the a lot of the nations in the UAE, the Middle East. I think we've really been seeing sort of upward trajectory in those relationships too. Maybe we can just take a couple of 2-3 questions together. Yeah. Since
try and keep your questions shorter because
sorry, my answers have been a bit long.
Yeah.
Hello. Okay. Hello, sir. My name is Fatima Nazish, and I'm from Pakistan. I work for Deutsche Welle, and I'm based in Peshawar, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. Since 2 days, and as today, we heard a lot of about India and China, but it's very unfortunate that we didn't get so much about Pakistan. And I'm sure your expertise are not just valid to the India, but you definitely have a keen eye on Pakistan issues. You just passed the information that it's not so good in terms of India-Pakistan relation. But I would really like to know that in terms of economy and trade, how you see Pakistan in next 20 years, because my Indian fellow asked you that it's a chance to India to become a superpower. So how you see Pakistan? Because we as a Pakistani upper collars, when we had from J.D. Vance that I love Pakistan, and President Trump that, oh, Pakistan is the best. But here, I think there is very unfortunate that we haven't got any good news about Pakistan's economy and trade. Thank you.
Thanks, Vinaya.
Thank you. My name is Elliot. I used to work for FT and the Wall Street Journal back in Beijing. Now I'm covering merger and acquisitions for the Capital Forum in Hong Kong. So just follow-up question on China and also India. I mean, for many years, people compare China and India on economic growth and also on politics. So one question is like now, because of the geopolitics, like companies are trying to diversify their supply chain like from China to other countries. Like for example, for Apple, their assembly line in Foxconn is now moving to India. But meanwhile, I mean, just one story we published actually this morning is that Apple is facing billions of dollars of penalties in India because the CCI launched an investigation into Apple. So there are some concerns like from the US tech firms worrying about like the business climate in India. So what's your think on that? And also what's your projections for China and India in the next 10 to 20 years? Thank you.
Hello, my name is Umar Bacha Khan. I am from Islamabad, Pakistan. I work for Dawn. My question is very simple. What policies are behind the India current progress and when they are initiated?
Sorry, I couldn't get the question.
What are the India current policies and when they are initiated about the progress of India?
On the borders?
Indian policies,
Okay.
current policies.
Hi, Ranjay, how are you? This is Rupali Mukherjee from Times of India. My question was actually related to the India-China bit. We know about the complexity of the relations. Do you see East Asian, South Asian, other countries actually kind of emerging as kind of, ties with, I mean, if India could kind of develop more ties with them and trying to kind of, not thought, but build a more kind of bigger this thing in terms of the economic play we could play in the entire global role. And the other was in terms of, has India, do you think, emerged as a credible alternative to China? For years, we heard that India could be a manufacturing hub for a lot of some companies did set up. So, do you think that would still be possible? There's a huge dependence on China. I mean, globally, every country depends on China. So, do you see that kind of happening? And in that, like the world's China plus strategy, which, we've heard about. Thank you. Sorry, two little long questions.
Right. There are quite a few questions, and I don't think I have answers to some of them, but just to sort of go backwards, and that's related to your, I think there is more American investment, some, Apple, etc., happening in India, but I think India is a long way from matching China to becoming kind of the manufacturing, hub of the world for various reasons. So, but there will be definitely more investment happening, but not to the extent that India is sort of going to sort of reach where China is. That's not going to happen very soon. And I think that's also tied to, yes, I think India is seriously looking at, Southeast Asia and looking eastwards. That's something that's happening from the 90s, 2000 onwards. And we see, much more of that being translated into action recent times. In fact, one of the unfortunate, I would say, fallouts also because of India's thorny relationship with Pakistan, and that kind of, comes back to your question. India is actually increasingly sort of, SARC, the South Asian sort of regional forum is a bit of a, red letter. It's nothing's really happening. So India has actually been focusing on, sort of integrating the East, Southeast Asia into sort of the South Asian bloc. So you have something called the BIMSTEC, right? Which is a bit of a mouthful, like the Bay of Bengal, multi-sectoral, something for economic cooperation where, Bangladesh, India, and you actually have Thailand, right? So I think India is increasingly looking eastward rather than, to sort of cutting out, unfortunately, in a sense, Pakistan. That kind of comes to your question. I don't really have a good answer to, where Pakistan's economy is headed. I think there have been a lot of, constraints both internal and external on the Pakistan on economy. But I think it is a sort of bright spot that Pakistan was able to play the sort of broker in the the current peace, and that's caused a bit of heartburn in India, by the way. That actually, which actually logically shouldn't do. It doesn't really matter, who plays the peacemaker as long as peace is brought about. So yeah, I don't really have a good question on the borders. That's extremely complicated question. But I think the fact is that India and Pakistan did have right. So you had the so the India's the official stand has always been whenever there is a terrorist incident in India and which India sort of thinks is linked to forces within Pakistan, not necessarily the Pakistani state. India's policy, stated policy now, in the last decade or so, has been that we are going to sort of cross the border, push back, even if it involves sending in both troops but also aircraft, which is quite different from what was followed by the earlier dispensation. So and I think I should probably conclude here, since we are probably running out of time, is that when you had the the 2008 Mumbai terror attack, which India and there was credible evidence linking it to groups that were operating within Pakistan. I think that's not really disputed. India actually chose the path of restraint, the then UPA government. There was actually a lot of pressure on the Manmohan Singh government to attack Pakistan, but the government at that time did not. And then it did take other measures, but it did not take an outright. But the current government has, I think, its policy frontal is that if there is a terror attack in Indian shores, which they think, is can be ascribed to forces operating out of Pakistan, they are going to, take, and strike back. So that's where we are. And last year, what is called, the operations that happened on the Indian side was directly linked to, the incident that happened in Pahalgam. So that's the stated policy. You can agree or disagree with that policy, but if and when an incident happens, I think we are going to see a border conflagration taking place under the current dispensation. As and when, if we have a new dispensation in India, maybe the policies might be more restrained. But as of now, that's the stated policy of the Indian government. Yeah. Pardon? That's something maybe, yeah. Vis-a-vis Pakistan or no? Right, I think that's kind of a large question that might be.
Sorry, what is the question?
Difficult to. Right.
What is it?
Right.
Is the question what is India's current economic development policy? Well, I would characterize it, and I suppose there are many other Indians here who might know better, but it is characterized more toward the export-led end of the spectrum. They have moved away from quite a committed position on import substitution strategy. Part of it was India's hand was forced by a financial crisis in the early.
Yeah, I think you have some of the slides there which shows in the 1990s you had the balance of payment crisis, and then India opened up what was known as the license Raj, a lot of red tape bureaucrat. That was lessened. So I think India is following that policy of export-led growth. The success of it could be debated to what extent India has managed. But I think India's growth rate has been fairly steady. It's again, I think the policies will be sort of export-led growth. Again, I'm not an expert on this. I think that will be the sort of path path going forward.
Yeah, services has come to lead.
Yeah, and again, if you look at the
great surge
the pie charts,
yes,
in the services is really the engine of India's economy.
And a great possibility is that services might become the most dominant driver of India's future growth. I mean, its potential as a manufacturing hub is kind of sort of like hobbled a little bit because it is a democracy. But on that note, I suppose, are we bumping up against time? And on that note, I just want to say that India is bumping up against the fact that it is the world's largest, most populous democracy right now. And what happens in India, as you correctly point out, in terms of economic development, is engagement with the world, is a test of what democracy really is. Keir Starmer, is an example of maybe what's not so great about what's happening in democracy these days. So I hope India does better.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sen. We're just delighted to have you.
I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did and learned as much. So please thank Dr. Sen and Chuin Wei.